people are buying their homes later, which means that they're buying their first home at the time when they're going to need the biggest house they're ever going to need, which is when they have kids.
Not just about the number of homes, but it turns out that family-size homes explain twice as much around the decline in fertility.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking about how the housing shortage is causing families to have fewer babies. And we're bringing the science to back it up.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So, Cara, one of the more frustrating aspects about being a traditional research academic, and one of the reasons why I try to avoid doing academic research, is that most research is trying to show or prove something that is pretty obvious to most of the rest of humanity. So, I have to know, when I told you about a new study out of the University of Toronto that found that housing affordability has directly contributed to the declining fertility rate in America, I have to know, what was your reaction?
It feels really obvious that that would be the result of the study. I've seen studies that show that women are having fewer kids than they otherwise want to, if their circumstances allowed them to. And I find that really sad. And housing is clearly not the only factor, and the study didn't say it was. But there's no way you can convince me that having no path to a family-size home doesn't play a role in having a family. So from this study, we learned that for sure, people in America are having fewer kids because of housing affordability. But what were the details?
So this study looked at a 30-year period between 1990 and 2020, and it was for the United States, and they found that 51% of the decline in the fertility rate can be explained by housing affordability and availability. So that means that 49% is a variety of other factors, but clearly it is the primary reason why America's fertility rate is dropping. They found that if this hadn't happened, 11% more children would have been born in the United States during this period. That's 13 million more kids. So we can say that the decline in housing availability and affordability has reduced childbirths by 13 million. And what it also finds is not just about the number of homes, but it turns out that family size homes explain twice as much around the decline in fertility. All types of homes are important, and the supply of any type of home will increase fertility, but larger family size homes are twice as important or twice as valuable when it comes to this. And they find that there's basically two things going on. That first, the lack of housing affordability delays things like people moving out of their parents' house. It delays marriages and that sort of thing. But the second factor is that it also reduces the number of children that families have. That if they're in smaller homes or having trouble paying the bills, they're a lot less likely to have that second, third, or fourth child. So overall, this is a massive result and really does prove what I've always thought was kind of obvious, that housing affordability absolutely causes families to have fewer children than they otherwise would.
Those numbers are huge. Like, I hear those and I'm thinking, that's a lot of children. And I guess some of it might be coming from the sizes of homes, but also you mentioned that some people are like delaying marriage, delaying getting into relationships. And the older you get, the harder it is to have kids. So I imagine that that's also playing an indirect role as well as a direct role. And as you said, in a previous episode, Canada is the worst in the OECD for housing affordability. So I wonder, given that this study is looking at American numbers, which I assume is because America tends to have better data than Canada, but I don't know if that's the case in this situation. But do you suspect that Canadian numbers are higher in terms of the number of kids that are missing because of housing affordability?
Yeah, I do think if we studied this for Canada, we would find similar results. And we got to see that across provinces, that we've had bigger declines in fertility rates in Ontario and British Columbia than in other provinces. That Quebec used to have by far the lowest fertility rates, but Ontario and B.C. Have declined quite a bit to kind of catch up with Quebec. And a lot of that is, I believe, due to those differences in housing affordability. That, not a surprise, the two most expensive provinces have seen the two biggest declines in fertility rates.
Overall, I was kind of surprised that this is a new idea and that anyone would look at this as a surprising result. Although, anytime I've like posted online saying something about housing affordability and the number of children people have, people always kind of jump out and go, well, really, it's about education, it's about choices. It has nothing really to do with housing affordability. And we actually received a comment on a recent video that we posted where someone pretty much said that. So I wanted to read a shortened version of it. And this comes from a username pgigrin1124. The argument that people are not starting families because of affordability is a common misconception. In Canada, fertility has been sub replacement since the 1970s. You can easily look up that data. Houses were affordable in the 1990s, yet people only had 1 to 2 children on average, not enough to sustain the population level. That's why we took in so many immigrants in the recent years, most of whom were born in the 1990s, to compensate for the children that the boomers never had. Plus, let's face it, you don't need to own a big home to raise a family. The issue with low birth rates is not income or house prices, it's way more complicated than that. And if anything, it's more likely to be about modern Westerners being too used to comforts and not willing to make sacrifices. What did you think of that response?
So there is some truth to these comments that it is absolutely true that Canada's fertility rate fell below replacement levels around 1971 or 1972. That is a thing that happened. It is also true, as the previous study reports, that there are many factors that have contributed to the fall in fertility rate, not just in Canada, around the world. So those parts of it are true, but that also, doesn't mean that this can't be a portion of it. And I think in recent years, this is a large portion of this. And I often hear this that back in the 1950s and 1940s, families lived in a 900 square foot home. Yeah, where are young people going to find that home today? My dad grew up in one of those strawberry box post-war homes. Nowadays, and this is in London, Ontario, nowadays that home's about 550,000, which, if you are a personal support worker married to a restaurant server, you're not going to qualify for that mortgage. Right. So this idea that, oh, well, we can just buy the homes that we could in the 1950s and everything would be fine, but these decadent Westerners are refusing to. I defy anybody to afford one of those 1950 style homes. And if you try to buy one in Etobicoke or North York, they're over $2 million. So I don't understand what these people are talking about. This idea that, oh, well, we should just do the things that they did in the 50s. Those options are off the table in large parts of the country. That's my Gen X rant. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of those homes, a lot of them don't exist anymore in that they've been made bigger over the years. You can walk through like my neighborhood around East York. There's a lot of those old small homes. I live in one of those old small homes
Mhm.
that's under 1,000 square feet. And I think that there are some of them around. A lot of them have been torn down and made bigger. That's just what happens over time. And historically, people were able to give their children a similar or better lifestyle than what they've gotten. And this is the first generation that isn't able to do that. And so that's not lost on anyone. So, yes, we can look back a few generations and say people lived with more people per bedroom. But that isn't going to make people feel better about not being able to give their kids anything near the quality of life that they had growing up. And we know that millennials are buying homes later, as you said. And I have to think that plays a role in this as well, because people say to me, millennials, you guys just want to buy your forever home first. And that's not how it works. Start small and work your way up. I think that what they're missing is that people are buying their homes later, which means that they're buying their first home at the time when they're going to need the biggest house they're ever going to need, which is when they have kids. So I'm like pretty tired of hearing people say
Mhm.
that. And we need a solution for that because it's not going to get better for Gen Z. And people don't have to have kids, but society does need a younger generation. So if we want to solve that problem, we've got to find a solution that isn't just, well, lower your standards, live like they did, 100 years ago, even though society has progressed. And a lot of what I hear in discussions about whether to have kids does have to do with housing size. I hear many people saying, ideally it'd be nice to have another kid, but we'd have to move. And I can't afford a bigger house. You had a piece on Substack recently, which we'll link to in the show notes, on how big homes need to be in order to adequately house a family. So, can you give us like a shortened version of that argument that you made in that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in both international and national law, we have this concept called the human right to housing, that everyone in the country should have access to safe and comfortable housing that suits their needs. And you need to have a way to measure whether or not that human right is being met. In Canada, we have a metric called core housing need, and we can identify, who in the population is having their core housing needs met and who isn't. And there's three big components to core housing need. One is, can you afford to live there, and after you pay your rent or your mortgage or whatever, that you still have enough money to be able to get your groceries and do those things, right? So an affordability metric. The second is the home in good condition? Is the roof caving in, that kind of thing. And the third is around the size of the home, which is referred to as suitability. So, whether or not a home is suitable for a household is defined by something called the National Occupancy Standard, or NOS. And what the NOS looks at is how many people are there in their family versus how many bedrooms. So, suitability is defined by the bedrooms in the home, not square footage or anything like that. It's a kind of a complex relationship because it's not kind of one to one people to bedrooms. For instance, it does say that there can only be two people to a bedroom, but there are some instances where that wouldn't be allowed. So if you have two teenage kids of different genders, they should each be in their own bedroom, and so on. So what the federal government has found in Census 2021, if you look at the national occupancy standard, is that the biggest shortage of homes are larger homes, and they're not, it's 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, 5 bedroom, and so on. In many cases, 7 bedrooms and up. So you take an example of there were 25 international students all living in one home in Brampton. Well, they would need a lot of bedrooms in order to suitably house that household. So it's a complex relationship, but it's basically the government's way of measuring whether or not a home is suitable, and ultimately measuring whether or not we're meeting our national and international housing as a human rights obligation.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people could hear that and go, "Yes, that okay, I can understand that if you have a bedroom, maybe the parents are sharing a bedroom." But as you said, teenage kids of different of opposite sex, like, they probably aren't happy to be sharing a bedroom. It's probably not that appropriate at a certain age to be sharing a bedroom. So I think that's, like, one of those things where you hear it and you're like, "Oh, yep, that just matches with common sense," I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is often misinterpreted as saying that the number of bedrooms should equal the number of the people in households. And the national occupancy standard does not say that at all. It's far more pragmatic. That pragmatism makes it a little bit complex, but overall, it's the best measure we have of whether or not homes are suitable and whether or not Canada is meeting our human rights obligations when it comes to housing. As of Census 2021, there were 3.5 million Canadians living in unsuitable housing, housing that's too small to meet their needs. But some groups are more likely than others to live in unsuitable housing. So Cara, let's play a little game here. Can you guess which groups are more likely to be living in unsuitable housing in Canada?
I'm sure families are in there. I'm thinking that there's probably a bunch of families who are living in maybe two-bedroom apartments where they actually need 3 bedrooms. Maybe they were rolling the dice and seeing if they would have 2 kids of the same sex and they could share a bedroom, but they didn't, and so now they need a bigger space. I imagine there's a lot of families in that situation, but also just in the situation of they can't afford a big enough home. There aren't enough homes out there that's within their budget that they can actually move into that space. I suspect there's a generational divide in that people who bought a long time ago. Especially, there's a lot of seniors who are living in the homes where they raised families that are living in situations where they are adequately housed, at least, if not overhoused by these standards. I don't know if these standards include overhoused as well?
No, it does not include overhoused, because it's basically looking at human rights, and I don't think anybody would consider it a human rights violation to live in a McMansion by themselves.
That's fair. What about when it comes to, you said international students? I wonder whether newcomers are adequately housed in general.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. The people who are most likely to be underhoused are non-permanent residents, recent immigrants to Canada, persons of color, and so on. But there are other groups that appear there. So children, particularly young children, are far more likely to live in unsuitable housing than older populations.
Young children being what age?
So there's two groups. So they look at I think kids under the age of 6 and then 6 to 17. Both of those have very high rates of living in unsuitable housing, but slightly more for younger kids.
Interesting.
And well, yeah, and I think a lot of it is you have a couple who's living in a small condo and they have a kid, and they need at least two, sometimes maybe three bedrooms. And the most common form of underhousing is people who live in a two-bedroom home that really should have a three-bedroom home.
I guess that makes sense that people who have kids who are a little bit older probably bought before prices started skyrocketing and maybe were able to get that suitable house.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. Or maybe they were driven nuts by their kids, and the family broke up, and now they're two family. And I say that
Oh.
glibly, but you actually see that in the data. So the lack of housing causes all kinds of these societal problems and societal issues. So this is a real problem, and one of the things that we see most is the most common areas to see unsuitably housed people are large metro areas. So Toronto, Vancouver, and so on. Rural areas, it's not as much of a problem. It does still exist, but nowhere to the same extent. This really is an issue for large, dense municipalities that they just don't have enough family friendly housing.
There was a part of this study that I kind of found interesting because it said, well, it mentioned that part of it about not, people not having enough 3 to 4 bedroom homes, but it critiqued the Yes in My Backyard movement, the YIMBY movement. And what it was specifically critiquing is the way that a lot of YIMBYs will say all supply is good supply. And they suggest that instead you should encourage family size housing specifically. And I know that I'm definitely guilty of saying all supply is good supply. And despite what the study says, I still believe that. Even small homes are so expensive, which tells me they're still needed. And I know they're not needed for families, but they are needed in our society. As we talked about before, those 25 international students in one home. Well, I bet a lot of them would be very happy with a small, even those what we call shoebox condos sometimes, if they were at the right price point, which they are not. So that tells me we still need more. But I also get the concern that maybe the asks should be more specific. I just wouldn't want to see any city councils looking at this and saying, well, this building can only be approved if it has this number of 3 bedroom versus 4 bedroom, because I worry that like the number of restrictions that you add onto a development means the less likely it'll actually be built. And in reality, it just means fewer homes for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very legitimate concern. And to be clear, we need more of all types of housing. And I, don't want to put this in a situation where we're trying to pit one form against the other. That we need more of everything. I think we do disproportionately need more family size units, but that shouldn't come at the expense of smaller units. But I think you've identified a problem we see with policy making, particularly at the municipal level, where we get into this mindset of we need more X, therefore we will put on these restrictions that say you have to do X. And sometimes that's a good idea, but most of the time is basically ignoring the root causes, right? It's trying to do an end run around the problems and say, okay, we're not actually going to fix anything. We're just going to paper over the issue and then, try to legislate some outcome. But if you don't deal with the root causes, it's not going to be successful. Right. So, we have to understand why we don't have enough of these 3 and 4 bedroom homes. And that's, everything from building code to zoning to land use issues and so on. So that has to be the answer. We have to go back and look at root causes and not just paper over problems and try and legislate the outcomes that we want. Because you're absolutely right. That's not going to work. And it's going to lead to all kinds of unintended consequences, including people just not building anything.
I wanted to go back to what you said before about this being largely a city problem. What are the consequences of people not being able to afford having kids in a city? What's the problem if they move out of the city to somewhere, maybe somewhere more rural where the houses are more family sized?
Well, I think there's a couple things that happen. The first, it's sprawl on steroids. One of the things I can't understand about municipalities and planners is they absolutely obsess around expanding urban growth boundaries and go, okay, we can't let our city expand out. And there's worthwhile reasons why they're concerned about that. That is a legitimate concern. But if you don't allow for enough building within the city, what ends up happening is they just move to the next town over and then drive back to work each time. So, in order to eliminate 500 meters of sprawl, you've extended sprawl 50 kilometers
Mm.
and all of the infrastructure that goes in place. And if you could keep those cities, those individuals in the city, they'd at least pay property tax to that city. But if they're moving to the next town over, they're paying their property tax to that town. So what happens is it hollows out the budget of the larger city, right? Because you have all these people working in the city, but none of them pay municipal property taxes. So you get this hollowing out. You see this a lot in the United States, where their towns didn't, in a lot of places, didn't amalgamate. So you have these little tiny downtowns where nobody lives, but everybody works and so on, and they have absolutely no revenue. And then you have these suburban towns that are quite well off. So you get this real problem with municipal finance. But the other thing that happens is sometimes those families move out of commuting distance, or let's say you've got a nurse who moves from Hamilton to Brantford. For a while, he or she might make that commute back into Hamilton till they realize, well, hey, Brantford needs nurses too. So what happens is you lose all of these great middle class workers in your large towns because they end up leaving and they end up getting local jobs. So you have these schools have troubles finding EAs, uh, hospitals have trouble finding nurses, personal support workers, and so on. So your city ends up losing its middle class in both a family sense, but also an employment sense. That you end up getting these very large skills gaps because you just can't find people who can afford to live there.
I'm guessing that the return to office movement sort of has made that worse, because people are now having to commute back in, although we don't need to get into that because we have a whole episode about that, which we will link to. Knowing that this is a problem, that we're not having enough 3 to 4 bedroom homes, how do we actually go about solving it?
Well, the number one thing we have to do is get out of this unit is a unit as a unit mindset that plagues governments. And it can be the federal government that says we need 500,000 homes a year, but they never specify what those are or how many of what. They just have a number. The province, in some sense, is even worse because they have their 1.5 million over 10 years and they have this tracker. And then they started counting student residences and long-term care beds and baby turtles as homes. Like it's just, they throw everything. Anything with a roof becomes a home, and it's absolutely ridiculous that we need to understand that not all homes are the same. That we need a diversity of homes, and our planning system has to allow for that. So that's number one thing. And then once you do that, then you need to create the conditions for those homes to be built. So once we've decided that we need more family size homes, we've got to figure out how to build them. And there's really two ways to do that: that we can build them out, that we can expand urban growth boundaries. We could have some very uncomfortable conversations about the green belt and so on, or we can build our cities up. We can make the regulatory changes necessary to build larger homes within the city. And there's a lot of building code issues like single staircase, which we've talked about before. There's issues around elevators in small apartments, everything from setbacks, angular planes, to you name it. The city of Toronto, for instance, puts a limit on how many bedrooms can be in a multiplex unit.
So weird.
It's weird, yeah. So a lot of times they're just regulated, like no, these things have to be a certain size, and you can't have too many people in it. So we've got to create the changes to zoning rules and development charges and building code and a lot of things like that. There's no one single fix here, but we have to change the project economics to make these projects viable. At the end of the day, builders and developers are going to build what's easiest and most profitable. And if building family size units is prohibitively expensive and a pain in the butt, they're not going to do it. And governments are never going to build enough social housing to make up for that. They're trying, but they've never gotten anywhere near the numbers we need. So ultimately, we have to change the taxes and change the regulations to change the market conditions and make these units pencil in the term that developers use.
I'm never gonna get over that maximum bedroom rule that the city put in, because it's like, I understand what they were doing with it. They didn't wanna have basically legal rooming houses everywhere. They don't want, it to be too loud, but I'm like, "Just enforce the existing bylaws. Stop forcing people to build smaller homes when that's not what we need." It's very frustrating.
Yeah, it truly is. And those 25 students, just end up being in a smaller home anyway. So you don't get rid of the concentration of people. You just ask them to live in a ultra concentrated area, which again, both international and national law says this is a violation of human rights, but it seems to be one that politicians and planners seem okay with.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about being a nurse in Brantford, Ontario, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.